foreign policy in the 1920s reflected the isolationism desired after World War I, but would set the stage for the coming conflict of World War II. With an arms race developing between the United States, Britain, and Japan, especially in the Pacific, disarmament was a topic that needed to be discussed, since militarism had led directly to World War I. So the United States sponsored a conference for the major nations of the world to discuss such issues. It is important to note this is outside the approval of the League of Nations because the United States is not participating in that body. In addition, though, to the arms race, a significant threat to world peace was a long-standing alliance between the British and the Japanese that would oblige Britain to come to Japan's aid in the event of a war, such as one that might break out between the U.S. and Japan, and tensions between those two nations were increasing. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes proposed that an existing 5-5-3 capital warship ratio between those three nations be maintained. Since France and Italy were also major maritime nations, they would receive a ratio of 1.75 each. Now, that does not refer to the number of ships, but instead to the tonnage. In return, Japan would receive guarantees that the United States and Britain would refrain from fortifying their Far Eastern territories, including the Philippines. This agreement was known as the Five-Power Treaty. Additional treaties were also signed at the Disarmament Conference, including a Four-Power Treaty that replaced the old Anglo-Japanese alliance and simply called for the preservation of the status quo in the Pacific. A Nine-Power Treaty was also signed with all of the participants that addressed trade with China and preserving China's territorial integrity and self-determination so that it would not become a colony of Japan or potentially any other country, which some feared was possibly about to happen. But there were significant loopholes, as wars were still allowed, and smaller ships, those under 10,000 tons displacement, those not considered capital warships, such as destroyers, cruisers, and submarines, were not included in the ratio, and therefore they could be constructed without limitation. Japan and Britain would both build massive numbers of ships that fell under that 10,000-ton limit, but the United States did not, causing it to lag dangerously behind. Due to growing unrest in Europe, partly due to a slumping economy, as well as Japan's aggressive moves in the Far East, a concerned United States and France met in 1928 and produced the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was eventually ratified by some 62 nations in all. In effect, the agreement made war illegal except for defensive purposes, but there was the major flaw of having no means of enforcement. Despite this, the United States accepted this pact as a guarantee against all future wars, which really just lulled them into a false sense of security throughout the 1930s. But then again, the 1930s would be dominated by the Depression, and that focused more of America's attention. Another foreign policy issue was the tariff. Harding believed that low tariffs were hurting American businesses, and that's what America's businessmen were telling him, as they feared cheap goods coming from a recovering Europe. So in 1922, not too long before his death, he signed the Ford-Macomber tariff. Tariff rates were increased from the 27% that had been the Underwood tariff, that was the one signed by Woodrow Wilson, to an average of over 38%, almost as high as the highly protectionist Payne-Aldrich tariff that Taft had signed back in 1909. Under this law, duties on farm products would also increase. Now, there were some allowances made for diplomacy purposes, as the president was authorized to make adjustments for individual countries or products as necessary to achieve various diplomatic goals, kind of like a dollar diplomacy. But in nearly all of the cases, adjustments were made upwards rather than downwards. The impact of the tariff, though, was that European post-war recovery would be significantly slowed, and they desperately needed to trade with the United States so they could earn money to pay the debts that they owed to the U.S. The only way they could get money was through trade, because the United States was still rapidly growing. In addition, the countries of Europe would retaliate against the United States by enacting tariff of their own, which also affected neighboring European countries and slowed the overall economic recovery. And then, of course, when the stock market crashed in 1929, triggering a worldwide depression, Europe's fragile economic conditions simply couldn't handle the strain, especially Germany. So all of Europe is going to be severely affected by this Great Depression. International debt would prove to be another significant problem for the United States because the US had emerged from World War I as a creditor nation and they wanted repayment of its loans. Of course, repayment would usually come in the form of money generated from trade. The British and the French tended to protest that the demands were unfair because they had sacrificed so many young men in order to achieve victory, and the United States had taken so long to join into the war. But US tariffs were making it nearly impossible for countries like Britain and France to sell goods to earn the money necessary to repay the debt because they needed to sell goods to a country that had money, and that was the US. So, to come up with the money to pay for the money they owed to the US, um, France and Britain demanded that Germany make enormous reparations payments. Those reparations payments had been negotiated as part of the Treaty of Versailles, and they were insisted upon by the British and the French. But Germany was unable to make these payments. Their economy simply couldn't handle it. The French tried to force payment by sending troops into Germany's industrialized Ruhr Valley in 1923, but it still didn't help. Some politicians here in the US thought that the debt should be canceled altogether or at least reduced in some way, a situation that President Coolidge and Britain and France refused. Instead, the United States helped to come up with the Dawes Plan in 1924, which restructured and rescheduled Germany's reparations payments. Under this plan, the United States would loan money to Germany to help them pay their reparations to Britain and France, who in turn would pay back the United States for their debt. So in effect, it's just shifting the where the money is coming from Britain and France onto Germany. The United States would continue to help with this issue of credit, um, at least until the crash in 1929 and the Great Depression focused more of their attention here at home. Regardless, U.S. policies towards the repayment of this debt generally led to ill will among the European nations towards the United States, and all except Finland never paid it back in full. And so now we begin to look at the Great Depression and the New Deal. As we look at this era of the Great Depression and the New Deal, it's important to remember this is not a short process because the United States economy had virtually collapsed in the 3 years following the stock market crash. The resulting Great Depression would continue throughout the 1930s until World War II finally brought prosperity. Under the leadership of FDR, the New Deal program for relief, recovery, and reform expanded the federal presence in the economy and guaranteed a wide range of social and economic benefits. The New Deal would also initiate in a limited welfare state and restore confidence in the American economic system. Much of the prosperity from the 1920s was a direct result of World War I and its aftermath. The United States had supplied Europe with the tools needed for war, as well as the products from farms that were needed to feed both armies, as well as the civilian population. As a result, investment in those companies caused the U.S. stock market to begin to grow in value, which continued throughout the 20s, increasing the total value of stock from $450 million to well over $8 billion in collective values in just the second half of the decade. However, this was a bubble of speculation, as a lot of individuals were purchasing stock on margin, which essentially means getting a loan in order to purchase stock. And the stock itself usually served as collateral for the loan, which was fine as long as stock prices were increasing and you were in a bull market. But although the economy was booming, there were some inherent weaknesses overall. There was a serious lack of diversification. Many consolidated, businesses had reestablished monopolies, and some industries were dominated by just a handful of large companies. And those few often dominated the stock market in terms of stock sales. America's purchasing power was also very much imbalanced, with half of American families not even being able to purchase the basic necessities of life, including food, housing, transportation, and some basic consumer goods. The banks and credit structure also provided a major weakness. For example, credit was easy to obtain, and a lot of Americans were living well beyond their means to pay back any loans that they got. And then, of course, international trade was a significant issue because that had virtually dried up due to the bad tariff policy. And as tariffs rose, trade stopped. And remember, trade is supposed to be a two-way street. This, coupled with the international debt and the reparations, meant that tremendous amounts of money was owed to U.S. banks. Many families in the United States were also living at or near the poverty level because the prosperity of the United States was very much concentrated among income earners. At the time, poverty in the United States was classified as those earning approximately $1,000 a year or less, and 42% of families made less than this. 60% or less made less than $2,000 a year, which, yes, it was middle class, but it was the lower end of middle class. And that meant they had very limited purchasing power, certainly if anything were to happen. The New York Stock Exchange, where all of these stock trades tended to take place, was particularly busy in the 1920s. Stocks were bought and sold by the thousands. The Dow Jones Industrial Average increased 500% in overall value throughout the 1920s, reaching what was then its highest point ever in September of 1929. However, it then began declining somewhat, and that decline would prove to be catastrophic. Throughout the 1920s, the federal government did little to involve itself in the U.S. economy. But beginning in the spring of 1929, even the federal government could not ignore the speculation that was going on in terms of rising stock values. It attempted to slow this down by raising interest rates to discourage Americans from buying stock on margin. But the attempt failed. The process of the Great Crash started with the downward trend in September of 1929 and eventually culminated in October over a series of days, starting with Black Thursday, October 24th, when investors, nervous about the growing discrepancy in the value of stock versus the value of the companies, began selling their shares. Nearly 13 million shares of stock changed hands. The banks, who were worried about losing investment dollars because of the loans where the stock itself was collateral, they stepped in and purchased many of these shares, and prices stabilized. Trading volume continued to be extremely high on Friday, October 25th, and Monday, October 28th, when a downward trend began again. Many times, though, the ticker tape that kept track of prices and was being printed out in various banks and offices and a few private homes for the extremely wealthy, they were running 90 minutes or to several hours behind real time, which made decision-making difficult. But then on Tuesday, October 29th, the big crash truly happened. Prices began falling again after having had the low values on the 28th. Panic sellers couldn't find buyers and offered lower and lower prices, but the banks could not step in and stem this crash because all their reserves had been used the previous week and they themselves were trying to unload stock. The crash itself was really not just the falling of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That's simply a measure of the panic in stock being traded. The crash was really caused by a multitude of issues. Over-speculation in stocks, over-expansion in some industries, overproduction of agricultural products followed by deflated prices, the introduction of credit for a variety of items, and then the collapse of overseas markets due to bad tariff policies. All of these things came together to trigger a panic that caused stocks to lose as much as 80 to 90% in value over the month that the stock prices continued to fall. The effects, though, included widespread unemployment, bank closings, and even foreclosures. And people who weren't involved in the stock market at all often lost everything as their banks closed.